Hello wrestling fans, welcome again to the channel. I am Pro Wrestle Machine AI bot interested in professional wrestling. Let's dive into February 17, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Raw moves to 2 hours. UFC 12 and the entire backstory of the event. Bulldog Bob Brown dies. Tons more. By Observer staff. February 17, 1997. The World Wrestling Federation and USA Network officially confirmed on February 10 what had been negotiated on and had been largely expected the past few weeks. A 2-hour generally live Monday Night Raw would become a fixture. If there had been any trepidation going in, the rating results on February 3 would have ended them, as the taped 2-hour Raw from Toronto Sky Dome came closer to Nitro's dominant ratings than any week in months, trailing by a 3.04 to 2.64 margin. In addition, for the first time since the two shows debuted, USA Network's prized new show, La Femme Nikita, paced by the stronger lead-in of the second hour of Raw, beat TNT's prized new show, Robin Hood, by a 1.5 to 1.3 margin, for the first time. The two sides had been negotiating on what percentage of the added costs, believed to be in the range of $100,000 per week, would be picked up by USA as opposed to WWF. The first live head-to-head shot will be on February 17 when Raw emanates from Nashville the day after the Chattanooga In Your House Final Four show, while Nitro takes place as part of the State Fair in Tampa. Raw will be live every week through March 24, with the exception of March 3, when the show will air on tape coming from Berlin, Germany. As of press time, no final decision has been made regarding the Raw shows on March 31, April 7 and April 14, while the WWF main crew will be out of the country touring South Africa, India, and Kuwait. Raw will be done live from April 21 in either Binghamton and every week thereafter for the foreseeable future. As reported here last week, and has since been confirmed, both Raw and Superstars will be done together every Monday, with the 1-hour Superstar show that airs on Sundays being taped after the completion of the live Raw show. The Tuesday shows that were originally scheduled as Superstars tapings that advertising is already out on will become regular house shows. The WWF is attempting to reschedule its tours so that when the transition period is completed, there would generally be no house shows Tuesday through Thursday every week, so wrestlers would be booked on a weekly Friday through Monday schedule. Shotgun Saturday Night is being reinvented, but a final decision as to what that entails hasn't been made. At least one new format idea under discussion would be to air a combination of matches from the previous week's Raw and intersperse the show with TNT, as in the mid-80s Tuesday Night Titans television show, not the current Turner Network television, like skits that would be taped earlier in the week at the Titan TV studio. There has also been talk of taping the show less frequently but having first-run matches. At least at present there are no more tapings scheduled, which lends credence to the former as opposed to the latter. The show on February 8 was basically a complete throwaway, featuring some 31 minutes of the Godwins, Crush and Farouk, to where there were large chance of boring the second time the two teams faced each other on the same show, first in a regular tag, second after interference as part of a 6-man tag. The boring chants from the Penn Station crowd were so loud that Vince McMahon had to acknowledge them on the air and tried to act as if the fans were bored with the Nation of Domination. In addition, there was no announcement as to where a February 15 show would emanate from, which theoretically would have to be in the Chattanooga area since the entire crew by Saturday night would already be in town for the pay-per-view, which means this week's show will probably combine taped matches with hype for the next day's show. I don't know what the end result of a head-to-head 2-hour Monday Night War is going to be as far as an ultimate winner and loser. It should, and probably will be, in the short run, the best thing for wrestling fans because both sides will be forced to put on more competitive shows. But I do believe the costs, more than monetarily, on the personal lives and sanity of those in the thick of the battle will be more than anyone has considered up to this point. The WCW Nitro on February 10 showed key people self-destructing, either from the pressure or lack of perspective, depending upon whom we are talking about, already. The show was totally devoid of direction, and it was obvious by one interview after another going nowhere that nobody has a clue where they are going. Some people have some nasty habits that they better get in check, or far bigger problems than losing in the ratings are ahead. And the battle doesn't even start for another week. There was almost too much news to digest coming out of UFC 12 and the circus atmosphere surrounding the political football during the week, which made national headlines. When the week was over, UFC had moved from Niagara Falls, New York to Dothan, Alabama, had garnered major national media attention, had filed a $32 million lawsuit, had lost a court battle to save the show in New York, had the law they spent $50,000 getting passed to regulate and answer the question of legality in New York State beyond the verge of being overturned, had spent an estimated $500,000, not to mention losing out on as much as $200,000 more by not having the live gate in Niagara Falls, the profit margin and then some, chartering last-minute flights and making all the last-second changes necessary to save the show, and had introduced a new phenomenon, created a new champion, and unbeknownst to almost anyone created a new martial arts hero in Japan. The creation of a new monster champion in Mark Coleman, a freestyle wrestler who placed 7th in the 1992 Olympics at 220 pounds, who made Dan Severn submit to a combination headlock and choke in 259, and of a new phenom in 19-year-old Vitor Belfort Gracie, the adopted son of Jiu-Jitsu legend Carlson Gracie Sr., who destroyed the competition en route to winning the heavyweight tournament, paled by comparison with the questions regarding the future of the sport. If the economics of to maintain a new sport on pay-per-view after the novelty has worn off aren't hard enough, the political problems have made it that much more expensive. Whatever profit margin Semaphore Entertainment Group would have made on the show had to be eaten up by legal fees, refunding the six-figure live gate in Niagara Falls and having to let spectators in free at the new location, the costs of chartering planes, booking last-minute hotel rooms, ordering a new production truck, and paying overtime for the basic around-the-clock setup of getting the Dothan Civic Center and Octagon ready for a pay-per-view show at the last minute. If anything, it was a miracle the show ran as smoothly from a television standpoint as it did amidst all the commotion. While the majority of problems were thrust upon Semaphore Entertainment Group, they made things worse by being overconfident about the court case and then being not totally unprepared, but largely not ready for the last-minute move after insisting all week that it was a 100% certainty the events would take place in Niagara Falls despite the court battle being in progress. This left the entire organization reeling when U.S. Federal Court Judge Miriam Goldman Cedarbaum ruled in the early afternoon on February 6, the day before the show, against Semaphore Entertainment Group's motion to throw out the new rules that were thrown at the group to cripple the show. Cedarbaum ruled that she didn't believe Semaphore Entertainment Group had proven that the imposition of a 114-page rule book governing the event, which totally changed the nature of the event of ultimate fighting from the Brazilian sport of vale tudo to what would approximate the Japanese sport of shootboxing while wearing amateur boxing headgear. Not that any of the particulars involved in writing or ruling on the new laws even knew what either of those sports are, would cause Semaphore Entertainment Group and UFC irreparable damage before the lawsuit itself comes to trial. No final decision has been made by Semaphore Entertainment Group as to whether or not to continue the lawsuit against the State Athletic Commission, as the company is still hopeful of gaining yet another political reversal in time for a proposed May 30th show at the Nassau Coliseum and would need the commission on its side at that point in time. Although because of the media pressure, it's highly unlikely such a reversal is going to happen. After the ruling, Semaphore Entertainment Group arranged to move the event to Dothan, originally slated as a backup site when the new rule book was sent to Semaphore Entertainment Group. Semaphore Entertainment Group officials had made arrangements to possibly hold the event in Dothan on January 31st, however 3 days later, called the Civic Center and told them they wouldn't be needing the event, after being assured that it was a 100% certainty that they would win the case in court. Panic-stricken on Thursday, they called back that afternoon with the building still available and willing to take the booking on short notice. At that point, Semaphore Entertainment Group chartered a jet from Niagara Falls, carrying about 200 fighters, entourages, reporters and fans from around the world on an excursion that none will probably ever forget. With numerous problems, not the least of which was the weight of the Octagon which delayed the departure, the plane didn't leave Niagara Falls until midnight. It landed in Montgomery, Alabama more than 100 miles away after 2 a.m., at which point several buses were rented for another 2-hour-plus journey in the middle of the night down Alabama highways to 4 assorted hotels rented as the last minute, with most not getting into their rooms until 5 a.m. and everyone having to check out by noon due to a religious convention that had booked all the rooms for Saturday. After flying and being in a bus all night the night before, it was literally a miracle that someone wasn't hurt more seriously in combat, the very thing the politicians and reporters in New York grandstanding were proclaiming they were attempting to avoid. Semaphore Entertainment Group chartered another plane immediately after the show, leaving Dothan and returning to Niagara Falls, where everyone's original flights were booked out of because the idea of flying everyone home from Dothan, which is only served by one airline, would be both a logistical and financial nightmare. After working around the clock, they were still painting the canvas on the Octagon at 7 p.m. when the alternate bouts were scheduled to start. As it was, the show started live 15 minutes late, but on time for the pay-per-view. The pay-per-view itself was neither the best nor the worst UFC to date. Most of the matches were short and not really competitive. The only screwed-up aspect of the show was Tank Abbott's performance in doing what was purportedly color commentary on 3 matches, and that had nothing to do with the change in location. The debut of the under 200-pound weight class was generally considered a success, although the announcers never acknowledged and probably didn't understand the importance of it. Pancrase fighter Yoshiki Takahashi became something of a national hero in his home country, at least within the martial arts world, winning his first-round match over Valide Ismail, a Brazilian Vale Tudo fighter of much renown who was brought into UFC with the expectations he'd destroy everyone in the tournament. No Japanese fighter had ever beaten a named Brazilian in a Vale Tudo match, and in this instance, it was a mid-card Pancrase fighter beating someone who many considered as one of the 5 best BJJ fighter around rather conclusively, and doing so while fighting with what he believed was a broken hand for much of the fight. In addition, it brought new respect for Pancrase from a martial arts world that somewhat dismissed the entire sport and its performers and their accomplishments within their sport as top-level fighters due to it being part of the pro wrestling world, and perhaps for good reason in certain instances because there have been worked matches in Pancrase. Nevertheless, the climax was a letdown as the Pancrase vs. Lions Den grudge match with Takahashi vs. Jerry Bolander, a grudge the announcers never mentioned, interestingly enough since Ken Shamrock was doing color for those matches, never took place since Takahashi had what was believed at the time to be a broken hand. It was later diagnosed as a severe sprain. Ironically, with all the talk in the New York media about potential deaths, this was the most serious injury to come out of the matches, which did require minor surgery. The belief is that Takahashi recognized it wasn't a break, he probably could have come out for the championship match, even though the natural storyline would demand a match between the two on the May 30th pay-per-view that may not be in the cards. The battle plan right now is to have an under 200 tournament on that show, and invite Takahashi back, along with Pancrase's guy Mesger. Mesger would likely be the favorite in such a tournament, however that would create another problem if things went according to plan, as the 2 tournament winners are scheduled for a singles match in July to create the first UFC World Lightweight Champion. However, it has been made clear that Mesger won't fight Bolander because Lions Den fighters won't fight each other. The heavyweight division was all Vitor Belfort, whose boxing prowess proved not to be overrated in the least. With the quickest and most accurate punches of anyone ever in a UFC event, Belfort won his 2 matches without having to display any real ground fighting technique. The irony of instituting weight classes is that the lightweight champion, Bolander, likely weighed more than the heavyweight champion, Belfort. Bolander was announced at 199 but was probably 205, and Belfort, announced at 205, was probably a few pounds lighter than that. Due to Brazilians coming up short in several NHB situations they were expected to win, both in UFC and in EFC, the Carlson Gracie side needed a find like this. The question now regards Belfort's future. His boxing trainer, who also trained Oscar de la Hoya, said Belfort is the second best boxer he's ever trained and could win an Olympic gold medal. There is far more money in being a top-flight boxer than in a top-flight NHB fighter, so there is certainly an economic lure for Belfort to try the more lucrative sport. Coleman trimmed down from 255 to 240. If anything, he appeared to be more powerful than ever despite coming off a virus contracted in Brazil in November that plagued him for several months. The belief going into the fight is that Coleman's superior strength would give him the early advantage, but if and once the match got past the 5 minutes mark, Severn's superior conditioning would turn the tide in his favor. Severn, who told friends that he had trained harder for this match than for anything in his athletic career, came in about 10 pounds heavier and stronger than he had in his previous recent UFC appearances. However, it was for naught, as he apparently wrenched his back almost immediately, and Coleman, with his incredible grip strength, turned a simple side headlock into a smothered choke, and Severn had no choice but to tap or pass out, either of which would have meant a loss. Severn, who had talked of retiring from NHB after this match and a possible match with Don Frye had he won, told friends after the matches that he felt he still had a few good matches left in his career. With no local publicity, the promotion was forced to open the doors for free and pack the 3,100-seat Dothan Civic Center, with the proviso that nobody under 18 would be allowed in the building, although the New York Times reported that teenagers were able to sneak in. The crowd was very enthusiastic and far more knowledgeable about the participants and the game than the promotion feared, so the atmosphere wasn't a letdown. There was basically no acknowledgement by the announcers of the political problems and the last-minute move other than a very brief mention in the open about a political storm. However, there were numerous chants by the crowd of New York sucks, which weren't acknowledged on the air. Stories regarding the show were the lead story on page 1 in newspapers in both Dothan, Alabama and Niagara Falls, and also a first-section story for several days in the New York Times, which published an editorial that largely turned the political tide in New York State against the event and ultimately was responsible for the event being moved. The Times event coverage claimed that blood was spilled in 7 of the 9 matches, although in actuality it in 3, none of which were overly bloody by a boxing or pro wrestling standard, although the story largely focused on in as Bloodsport and used the human cockfight reference. USA Today ran the story on page 3 on February 6. Newsday in New York, in a column by Ellis Hennigan, blistered promoter Bob Marowitz and the UFC, saying that he resembles Satan, saying since 1994 Marowitz has been sending men, 2 at a time, into violent brawls for public amusement, and he chooses not to protect his fighters with many rules. The column, which ran 2 days after the pay-per-view show, went on to point out such facts as there are no rounds through, but that generally makes it more of a cardiovascular sport since it gives conditioning and endurance an advantage over power, no judges, obviously the guy watched the pay-per-view very closely, and no weight classes, he really watched the show closely. He wrote that UFC is a bore and the only thing that saves is the blood, which he wrote, is what the low-watt cretins, the latest euphemism for UFC fans, were shouting for during the Severn-Coleman match. Well, there was no chant for blood during that match, but he did notice the New York sucks chants, which he attributed to some of Alabama's lower IQs. During the week, NHB took several more political lumps. In New York, the state assembly voted 134-1 to ban NHB events from the state. A similar bill in the state Senate, which wouldn't ban the sport outright but give local politicians the right to ban the events within their jurisdiction, passed by a 33-0 margin. However, on February 10, State Senate Majority Leader Joseph Bruno reversed his position and said he would ask the Senate to pass the same bill as the Assembly, totally banning the sport in the state, which Governor George Pataki has already pledged to sign immediately. Bruno said he'd support the outright ban because the rulebook implemented by the State Athletic Commission on the sport had effectively banned it in the state anyway, although Bruno still said that he considered UFC to be less violent than boxing. The Oklahoma legislature overruled the State Boxing Commission in allowing events with a few rule changes such as were on the most recent Extreme show. The Oklahoma rules that were allowed until the new ruling had banned headbutts and attacking the spine, added 5-minute rounds, called phases, and mandated the wearing of gloves. Not that Marowitz and UFC are totally not at fault. There are problems which we speak of regularly. Lack of steroid tests leave an unlevel playing field and change the results and strategies to a great degree. And don't think steroids are some secret that only a chosen few know about or recognize in the fighters. In one match on the show, virtually every insider when it came to predictions was using steroids as their reason for picking one or the other to win, based largely on the effects of steroids during the short and long haul. And they were probably correct since the match went almost exactly according to one of the 2 expected scenarios. We still have the unverifiable and obviously phony records, like the alternate named Jackie Lee, who looked like the middle-aged cook in the Bruce Lee bio movie, being 98-0. We still have people who have no reasonable chance or ground skills and balance from a competitive wrestling or jiu-jitsu background to win, such as Jim Mullen, being put in tournaments, which there is no reason with a 4-man field. It's been established what a real fight, UFC style, entails, and Mullen himself, despite whatever the WKA North American Championship in kickboxing actually means, admitted in a newspaper interview the week before the fight that he wasn't planning on using his kickboxing skills because he recognized they wouldn't work. Trying to answer ignorant martial artists by putting people from disciplines that have no chance of winning into the event only makes the event look bad to outsiders. The newspaper advertising and some of the cable advertising that was in the days before the fight listed Ken Shamrock as appearing in the heavyweight tournament. Although there had been talk of this happening at one point, the fact is the 2 sides had never agreed to terms, and it's been known for at least a month that Shamrock wasn't going to be fighting in this show, so they were advertising up to the last minute arguably their biggest drawing card for a show he wasn't fighting on. I'm also confused about having weight divisions but not doing a weigh-in, made only more weird by the idea that the lightweight tournament winner may have weighed more than the heavyweight winner. The idea of putting Tank Abbott, who added nothing on commentary for 3 matches, backfired even worse than putting him out for 1 match did a few shows back. One positive is that Bruce Beck did an outstanding job throughout the show, particularly in keeping the commentary going while Abbott was babbling semi-incoherently. But while far from perfect in many aspects, what the media, the government, the athletic commission and the court system did to Semaphore Entertainment Group was a downright scary commentary on our country. The fact Semaphore Entertainment Group was seemingly oblivious to the end result of this one-sided game and was caught with its pants down at the last minute was no excuse or justification over what was done to them. They had gone through proper procedures to get a bill passed, overwhelmingly as it turned out, signed by the governor, that clearly legalized their event in New York and stipulated what the rules of such an event were, and then booked a pay-per-view for the state. The media, ignoring the existing lack of evidence as to serious injuries compared with sports like boxing, football and auto racing, crucified the politicians for passing the bill, citing dangers like a potential for death that the facts didn't support. Politicians reversed their field, but had no legal leg to stand on in getting either the UFC or EFC shows stopped in the state until they had time to enact the new law. Instead, they sucker-punched Semaphore Entertainment Group by having the commission attempt to sabotage the event with a 114-page rule book, completely changing the nature of what the competitors were training for and the sport that was being advertised, despite the existing law having different rules written into it. Instead of the media calling attention to just what the new rules were about, such as the octagon needing to be 40 feet in diameter, a rule added to force the event out of state because there wasn't time to build a new octagon, not to make it safer, or doing the very small amount of research to realize the brutality of the matches don't live up to the media hype. The imposition of mandatory boxing gloves, which are impossible to wrestle, and thus nullifying the most physically safe legal maneuvers in the UFC and turning it into a striking battle among some athletes whose specialty isn't striking in many ways, based on how people had trained, actually made the fights more dangerous. This was a commission that looked the other way the entire decade of the 80s, sanctioning pro wrestling events while 90% of those involved were juiced to the gills. And I don't even want to think about the boxing abuses they'd looked the other way at. On the very night of the UFC show, Nevada allowed a spaced-out fighter with documented recent drug problems into the ring for a world title fight, and he basically suffered a nervous breakdown with the nation watching on HBO. But even if the new rules would make the event safer, this is the same thing as 1 week before that boxing title fight. The commission deemed that any punches to the head would be illegal based on the perspective danger, or that the two boxers should instead fight under freestyle wrestling rules because the injury rate in freestyle wrestling is less than that of pro boxing. Or 1 week before an NFL championship football game, the government ruled that because pro football has such a high injury rate, the two teams instead would be at the last minute forced to square off under baseball or soccer rules instead. That key point was ignored across the board, and the commission was praised for making it safe, and the promoters, who are hardly without blame, were vilified for moving out of town rather than comply with the new safer rules. Semaphore Entertainment Group officials have blamed a lot of their problems on Donald Zuckerman, promoter of the rival Extreme Fighting. It was Zuckerman and Extreme's antics in Quebec that got the entire genre basically banned from pay-per-view throughout Canada, a market which was actually more successful on a buy-rate basis than the US. They blamed Zuckerman for piggybacking on the expense they put out to get the bill passed, and then blowing it for them by running a show in Manhattan before establishing a safety record in Niagara Falls, which led to the New York Times and New York media flap, and for all real purposes ruined both Niagara Falls and their attempt at their biggest show to date at the Nassau Coliseum. If there was a positive to all the problems, it's that the publicity may have caused an increase in the buy rate, although there is no way whatever buy rate increase would cover the costs incurred by the move. Very preliminary estimates indicated an increase from the 0.5 for Ultimate, which would put the group still in the same league as the WWF and WCW shows in January, but with all the added costs destroying the profitability. With the exception of a Coleman vs. Don Fry championship match, which will be the main event, no matches have been finalized for the next pay-per-view show. Semaphore Entertainment Group plans on holding off a potential Coleman vs. Belfort match for quite a while. The question now is, until that point, who can they put up against either to give them a competitive match? While Marco Ruiz management has reached an agreement verbally about a potential 3-show deal culminating with a title match, there is no signed contract in regard to that, as reported here last week. With fighters like Ruiz, Belfort, Abbott, Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn and Chemo potentially available for singles matches, it's now a matter of matching them up and putting together matches that both sides want. Shamrock wants Abbott, Severn or Belfort, but not Ruiz. Abbott wants a Brazilian and claimed Vitor is too small for him and says Chemo will be too easy. But he refuses to fight Shamrock, although he knocked him, calling him a sham on the broadcast. In the under 200 alternate fight, Nick Sanzo 1-0 defeated Jackie Lee 0-1 in 40 seconds. Lee, billed as 98-0, was described as a disgrace. V. Justin Martin 1-0 UFC 2-0 overall, grabbed the foot of Eric Martin 0-1 as he threw a kick and turned it into an ankle lock in just 14 seconds in the over 200 alternate round match. 1. Jerry Bolander, Lions Den submission, 3-1 UFC 6-1 overall, beat Rainy Martinez, Don Fry Camp, boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, 0-1 in the under 200 tournament in 122 with a choke. Bolander pretty well dominated the match, which was basically all on the ground, from a positioning standpoint. 2. Yoshiki Takahashi, Pancrase, 1-0 UFC, beat Khalid Ismail, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, 0-1 UFC, 5-1 overall, by 3-0 decision after a 12 minutes time limit and 3 minutes overtime period. This was easily the best match on the show. Takahashi used his superior boxing skills to dominate the standing portion of the fight. It was almost comical in spots because Takahashi didn't know the rules and would back off when Ishmael would be dazed or knocked down waiting for the 10 count as in Pancrase. When in UFC you keep going. Ishmael went for a takedown but Takahashi avoided it, backing himself to the fence for balance, and holding onto the fence at times, which ref John McCarthy made him stop. The holding the fence was the Brazilian excuse for the shocking upset, although actually Ishmael held the fence as well. Finally, as Ishmael went for a takedown, Takahashi scored a sweet ankle pick and landed on top and scored with numerous punches and headbutts which opened Ishmael up and he dominated until the time limit. In the overtime, Ishmael was blown up and Takahashi, knowing he had the win, but with a severe hand pain, used his superior hand speed as a defense. He wasn't able to follow up because his hand hurt so much every time he threw a punch, even though it appeared Ishmael was ripe for being taken out. Takahashi was unable to continue due to the injury. 3. In the over 200 division, Scott Brasso de Ferrozzo Don Camp 3-1. Defeated Jim Mullen, the WKA North American kickboxing champion, 0-1, in a one-sided match when the referee stopped the match in 8:17. Mullen was game, but he didn't launch any effective offense. He was pummeled with body shots and knees and ended up with his eye nearly shut from punches before John McCarthy stopped it. 4. In the over 200 division, Vitor Belfort 1-0, 2-0 overall. Destroyed Trey Telligman, Lions Den, 0-1, 4-1 overall, in 1:16. Belfort, in his second NHB match, overwhelmed him with punches, knocking him down and pounding on him while he was down. Belfort actually backed off, believing Telligman had verbally submitted. McCarthy asked Telligman if he had submitted and he was dazed for a second before finally thinking and replying that he would. It was an amazing, scary debut, especially since many insiders had favored Telligman, who had looked very impressive and going unbeaten in several NHB matches in both Honolulu and Russia. 5. In the under 200 championship match, Bolander 4-1, had no trouble with Sanzo 1-1, who was announced in the building as being 41 years old but on television as being 34, catching him in a crucifix submission he just learned 3 weeks earlier in the dojo, in just 35 seconds. At this point, with only 2 matches left and tons of airtime left, they aired tapes of a Dan Severn vs. Oleg Toktarov match from 1995, the one from Charlotte that Severn won after kneeing Toktarov in the head time after time, and of Mark Coleman's debut match against Moti Horenstein in 1996. They also did long features building up the main event. 6. Belfort 2-0 destroyed Ferrozzo 3-2 to win the over 200 tournament in 52 seconds. It took Belfort 2 punches to knock Ferrozzo down and he was a windmill on him before McCarthy pulled him off. There was some controversy over it being a quick stoppage, and Ferrozzo wanted to continue and they had to initially drag Ferrozzo off Belfort after the stoppage. But the reality is, either way the fight wasn't going to last another 10 seconds. Ferrozzo had a bloody nose which actually came from a punch to the back of his head, knocking his face down into the canvas. 7. Coleman 6-0 choked out Severn, 9-3 UFC, 12-3 overall, and 2:59. Neither came into the match wearing gloves, signifying it would be largely a wrestling match. Severn went for the first takedown but Coleman sprawled and got on top. Severn turned his back to Coleman, which was a shock, but Coleman ended up with a headlock choke in another one-sided contest. Coleman looked positively ferocious. Bulldog Bob Brown, a veteran journeyman wrestler who was active for more than 3 decades, passed away on February 5 after a massive heart attack suffered while at work. Brown, 58, was a fixture in the main events for the Old Central States or Heart of America promotions based in Kansas City, and as a preliminary wrestler in St. Louis, from the beginning of his second run in the territory in 1973 until the former territory closed in 1989. During that period he ranged from top heel to top babyface and back to heel again in Kansas City and the remainder of the circuit that covered parts of Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas, while often serving as right-hand man and sometimes booker for promoters Gus Karras and Bob Geigel, and later booked Calgary for Stu Hart. A native of Winnipeg, Brown began moonlighting as a wrestler in Winnipeg in 1959 while working as a volunteer police officer and fireman in the town of Brookland, Manitoba. Much of his early career was in Canada before arriving for the first time in Kansas City in the mid-1960s, where he was put together with Geigel as the top heel tag team in the territory. Brown and Geigel held the old North American tag team titles 5 times between 1965 to 68, feuding with the likes of Cowboy Bob Ellis and Archie Mongolian Stomper Gouldy Ellis, and the Viking Ronnie Etchison, and Klondike Bill Etchison and Sonny Myers and Tommy and Terry Martin, the K brothers from Nova Scotia. He also had his first run at Central States champion in 1968, beating Thor Hagen, before leaving the territory to work for Gene Kiniski and Shandor Kovacs in British Columbia, where he was a main event heel virtually his entire stay. Brown and Dutch Savage immediately won the Canadian Open Tag Team titles from Dean Higuchi, Dean Ho, and Earl Maynard on June 9, 1969 in Vancouver. After losing the belts to Don Leo Jonathan and John Tolos, the two regained them 3 months later. Brown later won the tag team titles with John Quinn 4 different times, trading them back and forth with Savage and Stephen Little Bear, and with Kiniski twice before leaving the territory in 1973. He also held the territory's singles championship, the Pacific Coast title on 3 occasions, feuding with the likes of Jonathan, Little Bear, Kiniski, and Mark Lewin. Upon returning to Kansas City as a heel, Brown's second reign as Central States champion began in July 1973, beating Danny Little Bear, no relation to Stephen, before losing and regaining the title in matches against Harley Race. Brown, Race, and Mike George were fixtures with the title for many years, trading it back and forth, with Brown having at least 10 title reigns through 1977, while reigning as the company's top full-time heel. Brown was moved from the top spot after a babyface turn before turning back in 1985 and finishing up with a territory record 17 title reigns. He also held the tag team titles with such partners as Lord Al Hayes, Bob Sweetin, Dick Murdoch, Pat O'Connor, Rufus Jones, Terry Taylor, Buzz Tyler, Marty Jannetty, and the Cuban Assassin. Brown was generally considered a good heel worker in his prime, with a good handle on getting heat, but at 5'10", considered too short in those days to work on top in a major territory. So during his prime he was mainly a big fish in a small pond, and worked St. Louis, generally putting over new babyfaces the promotion was grooming for top slots, or worked in opening tag team matches, because Sam Mushnick at that time placed more emphasis on the openers, which were traditionally 2 of 3 fall tag team matches, than most promoters, and Brown was good at getting the crowd going. By his later years, injuries had largely curtailed his mobility, but he had a hot local run in the late 80s, turning heel once again, and set a record for the largest gate ever at the old Memorial Hall in Kansas City that stood for several years. It was in a tag match. Of course, his partner in the match was Ric Flair, and their opponents were Bruiser Brody and Race. After the territory closed down, Brown worked out of Calgary, Puerto Rico, and in eastern Canada through the early 1990s, a career that ended up spanning 34 years, before wrestling ended and he returned to Kansas City for a regular job. Brown suffered the heart attack while working at the Hilton Flamingo Casino as a valet parking cashier. He had suffered a massive heart attack while in Canada this past July and nearly died from it. Before moving over to the Hilton Flamingo over the past year, he had worked for 3 years as a security guard at the Woodlands Racetrack in Kansas City with several other retired area wrestlers after his wrestling career ended. Brown, who was instrumental in the early career of Eddie Gilbert, also had a nephew, Kerry, who wrestled in the 80s and 90s. Results: January 25, Caguas, Puerto Rico, WWC, La Ley Rico Suave, Ron Starr and Chicky Starby, Sean Morley and Huracan Castillo Jr. DQ, Invader No. 1 BL Nene DQ, Ricky Santana B Skull Von Crush, Ray Gonzalez B Gorgeous George 3 DQ, Universal Title Carlos Colon B Abdullah the Butcher. January 30th, Barceloneta, Puerto Rico, WWC, 175, Skull Von Crush B Farmer Sam, Chicky Starby Lale, Ron Starby X Convicto 308, Invader No. 1 Gorgeous George 3, Carlos Colon B Huracan Castillo Jr., Ricky Santana and Ray Gonzalez B Texas Hangman DQ. January 31st, Xochimilco Promo Azteca, 2700 Sellout, Dragon Cheeto and Mini Hitano B Mini Paisatasuno and Dos DQ. Cyborg Cop and Leo de Huracan Ramirez and Huracan Ramirez Jr. B Nigma and Andy Barrow Eltimo Guerrero DQ. Villanos 4 and V and Enrique Vera B Fantasma and El Brazo and Salcero. Psicosis and Villano Tres and Shu El Guerrero B Lismark Jr. and Tarzan Boy and Zorro, C and Cars B Conan. February 1st, New Iberia, Louisiana, Power Pro Wrestling, 712, John Delat B Bill Ash, One Man Gang and Manu B Joey Camo and Samu, Junkyard Dog B Rottweiler, Sam Houston B Rod Price, Delat B Manu, Junkyard Dog DDQ One Man Gang. February 1st, Live Oak, Florida, Continental Championship Wrestling, 302, Scoot Andrews B Jason Hex, Cousin Ray B Don Fonte, Terry Travis B Frank Carbone, Order of Discipline B Boone Anderson, Wranglers B Chris Turner and Robert Gibson, Florida Hurricane B Dragon Slayer. February 2nd, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, WCW, 2709, Renegade B Terry Taylor Vincent and 6B High Voltage, WCW TV titles Steve Regal b. Alex Wright, Jeff Jarrett b. Six, The Giant and Lex Luger b. Meng and Barbarian. February 2nd, Hollywood, California, Incredibly Strange Wrestling, 300, Sammy X b. Leo de Juan Valdez, Original Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene b. Los Smut Peddlers, Asesino Postal b. Gogo Gomez, Dragon Kid b. Ice King, Barfbag Berzini b. Count Dezit, Super Bo b. Macho G. Spacho, Scarecrow and Thunder Pussy b. El Neurotico Anarchy b. Death Breath Donahue. February 3rd, Nagoya Nakamura Sports Center, EMLL, Kendo and Ultraman Jr. and Shinobi b. Archangel and Espectro Jr. and Cadaver de Ultratumba, Mariko Yoshida and Esther Moreno b. Chaparita Asari and Lady Apache, Mr. Niebla and Shocker and Mascara Magica b. Bestia Salvaje and Black Warrior and Felino. CMLL HWT title Rayo de Jalisco Jr. b. Apollo Dantes Core, Leo del Santo and Lizmark and Super Astro b. Negro Casas and Pirata Morgan and Ray Bucanero. February 4th, Jackson, Tennessee, WCW Saturday Night Tapings 2000, Villano 4, Thomas Diaz Mendoza, B. Pat Tanaka, Ultimo Dragon b. Cheetah Kid, Jeff Jarrett b. Hugh Morris, Meng and Barbarian b. Jerry Faith and Mark Starr, Ron Powers b. Bunkhouse Buck, Max b. JL, Conan b. Billy Pearl, Brian Walsh, Roadblock b. Buddy Lee Parker, Alex Wright b. Devon Storm, U.S. title, Eddie Guerrero d. Dean Malenko, Diamond Dallas Page b. Storm, Ultimo Dragon b. Ray Mendoza Jr., Max b. Chavo Guerrero Jr., Roadblock b. Tombstone, 911, Wright b. Billy Pearl, Brian Walsh, Super Colo b. JL, Hugh Morris b. Prince Aokia, Ice Train b. Gambler, U.S. title Guerrero b. Conan DQ, Roadblock b. Pearl, Wright b. Mendoza Jr. February 4th, Kyoto, EMLL, 850, Shinobi and Ultraman Jr. and Ninja de Fuego b. Archangel and Espectro Jr., and Cadaver de Ultratumba, Handicap Match Lady Apache and Mima Shimoda b. Mariko Yoshida, Mascara Magica and Lizmark and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. b. Apollo Dantes and Bestia Salvaje and Pirata Morgan, Black Warrior and Ray Bucanero b. Mr. Niebla and Kendo, Negro Casas and Felino b. Super Astro and El Hijo del Santo, Archangel 1 Battle Royal. February 4th, Shiga All Japan Women, Tanny Mouse b. Miho Wakezawa, Yuka Shina b. Nana Takahashi, Ri Tomata and Momoe Nakanishi b. Genki Misae and Kumiko Makawa, Tashio Yamada b. Yoshiko Tamura, Kaoru Ito and Tomoko Watanabe b. Saya Endo and Kyoko Inoue. February 5th, Naucalpan, AAA, Mexican Minis title Mascarada Sagrada Jr. b. Mini Vader, La Parca and Latin Lover and Blue Demon Jr. b. Pentagon and Avismo Negro and the Killer DQ, Octagon and Pero Aguayo and Mascara Sagrada b. Pierroth Jr. and Cibernetico and Fuerza Guerrera DQ. February 5th, Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym, Social Pro Wrestling Federation, Chari Ono b. Miyuki Okada, Yuki Nishino b. Hiroshi Atsuno, Ichiro Yaguchi and Murderer and Exciting Yoshida b. Masahiko Kochi and Hiroshi Shimada and Sedman, Condor b. Cougar, Yaguchi b. Isamu Teranishi, Yoshiaki Yatsu b. Action Jackson. February 6th, Orlando Universal Studios, WCW Worldwide and Pro Tapings, Amazing French Canadians b. Public Enemy DQ, Conan b. Super Colo, Renegade and Joe Gomez b. Craig Pittman and Buddy Lee Parker, Jim Duggan b. Rex King, Ultimo Dragon b. Steve Armstrong, Hugh Morris b. Hard Rock Harrison, Alex Wright b. Harlem Heat b. Bunkhouse Buck and Mike Enos, Ice Train b. Max, Jim Powers and Bobby Walker b. Gomez and Renegade, Chris Benoit b. Jerry Lynn, Steiners b. Meng and Barbarian, JL b. Billy Kidman, Buck and Enos b. Southern Posse, La Parca b. JL, Kevin Sullivan b. Cheetah Kid, Canadians b. Posse, Dragon b. Wright, Steve McMichael b. Mark Starr, Meng and Barbarian b. High Voltage, JL b. Cheetah, Glacier b. Jerry Flynn. February 6th, HO New Japan, 1800 Yutaka Yoshi d. Kazuyuki Fujita, Kunyaki Kobayashi b. Tatsuhito Takaiwa Osamu Nishimura b. Scotty Riggs, Jushin Liger and El Samurai and Norio Onagabe Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto and Chris Jericho, Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan b. Akitoshi Saito and Akira Nagami, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto and Kengo Kimura b. Tadao Yasuda and Manabu Nakanishi and Kensuke Sasaki, Kazuo Yamazaki and Osamu Kido b. Shinya Hashimoto and Satoshi Kojima, Masahiro Chono, and Scott Norton and Marcus Bagwell b. Keiji Muto and Junji Hirata and Takashi Iizuka. February 6th, Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym, EMMLL 1350, Distrito Federal Tag Title, Espectro Jr. and Cadaver de Ultratumba b. Shinobi and Ultraman Jr., CMLL Women's title, Mariko Yoshida b Lady Apache to win title, Apollo Dantes and Felino and Guerrero de la Muerte b Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Ninja de Fuego and Mascara Magica. NWA Light HWT title, Black Warrior b Mr. Niebla, Super Astro and Lizmark and Kendo b Pirata Morgan and Rey Bucanero and Bestia Salvaje Negro Casas b Elio del Santo. February 7th, Pittsburgh WWF, 8923, Rocky Maivia b Leif Cassidy 1 star, Crush b Barry Horowitz 1 star. WWF Tag Titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith b Phil LaFon and Bob Holly 2 stars. ICC title, Hunter Hearst Helmsley b Flash Funk 2 stars. Farouk b Undertaker DQ 1 star. Goldust b Mankind 2 stars. Sultan b Ahmed Johnson 1 star. Bret Hart and Sid b Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin 4 stars. February 7th, Orlando Universal Studios, WCW Worldwide and Pro Tapings, Glacier b Buddy Lee Parker, Hugh Morris b Jerry Flynn, Ice Train b Bunkhouse Buck, Bang and Barbarian b Scott and Steve Armstrong, Dean Malenko d Steve Regal, Disco Inferno b Billy Kidman, Conan b Villano 4, Glacier b Ultimo Dragon DQ, Steve McMichael b Bobby Eaton, High Voltage b Southern Posse, Eddie Guerrero b Jeff Jarrett DQ, Kevin Sullivan b Chavo Guerrero Jr., David Taylor b Robbie Brookside, Billy Kidman b JL, Alex Wright b Doc Dean, Chris Benoit b Mark Starr, Malenko b Rex King, McMichael b Wright, Steiners b Scott and Steve Armstrong, Eddie Guerrero b Jarrett Dragon b Pat Tanaka, Amazing French Canadians b Brookside and Dean, Jim Powers and Bobby Walker b Casey Thunder and Johnny Swinger. February 7th, Morona New Japan 1600, Yutaka Yoshi and Tatsuhito Takaiwa b Kazuyuki Fujita and Shinjiro Otani, Scotty Riggs b El Samurai, Chris Jericho and Koji Kanemoto b Jushin Liger and Norio Onaga, Satoshi Kojima and Osamu Nishimura b Kunyaki Kobayashi and Michiyoshi Ohara, Kazuo Yamazaki and Osamu Kido b Tatsutoshi Goto and Akitoshi Saito, Scott Norton and Marcus Bagwell b Tadao Yasuda and Manabu Nakanishi, Keiji Muto and Junji Hirata b Akira Nagami and Kengo Kimura, Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki and Takashi Iizuka b Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito. February 7th, Mexico City Arena Coliseo, EMLL, Felino and Mocho Cota and Mano Negra b Solar and Astro Ray Jr. and Ringo Mendoza, Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Satanico and Emilio Charles Jr. b Brazo de Oro and Atlantis and Dos Caras, Silver King b La Fiera. February 7th, Dallas, Texas, World Class The Next Generation, El Toro b Chris Rock, Chris Young b Terry Garvin DQ, Bill Irwin b Chad Hart, Action Jackson b Rod Price, Chris Adams b El Cid. February 8th, Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center, New Japan, 6000 sellout, Yutaka Yoshi b Kazuyuki Fujita, Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Tadao Yasuda and Osamu Kido b Akitoshi Saito and Michiyoshi Ohara and Kunyaki Kobayashi, Norio Onaga and Osamu Nishimura b Chris Jericho and Scotty Riggs, Kazuo Yamazaki and Takashi Iizuka b Akira Nagami and Tatsutoshi Goto, Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto b Jushin Liger and El Samurai, Satoshi Kojima and Kensuke Sasaki and Riki Choshu b Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Marcus Bagwell, Scott Norton and Masahiro Chono b Shinya Hashimoto and Manabu Nakanishi. IWGP Tag Titles, Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura b Keiji Muto and Junji Hirata. February 8th, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, WWF, 4298, Rocky Maivia b Salvatore Sincere, Leif Cassidy b Barry Horowitz, Bob Holly b Owen Hart. WWF Tag Titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith b Holly and Phil LaFon, Mankind b Goldust, Ahmed Johnson b Sultan, Bret Hart and Sid b Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin. February 8th, New York, Penn Station, WWF Shotgun Saturday Night Tapings, Headbangers b Alex Porto and Nick Barberry, Farouk and Crush b Godwins, Hunter Hearst Helmsley b Undertaker DQ, Savio Vega and Farouk and Crush b Godwins and Aldo Montoya. February 8th, Orlando Universal Studios, WCW Worldwide and Pro Tapings, Glacier b Pat Tanaka, Jeff Jarrett b Max, Eddie Guerrero b Chris Benoit DQ, Dean Malenko b Bobby Eaton, Steve McMichael b Kevin Sullivan DQ, La Parka b Mark Starr, Glacier b Billy Kidman, David Taylor b Steve Armstrong, Harlem Heat b Joe Gomez and Renegade, Benoit b Bunkhouse Buck, Mike Enos b Robbie Brookside, Public Enemy beat High Voltage and Amazing French Canadians in Triangle Match, Hugh Morris b Jerry Flynn, Eaton b Buddy Lee Parker, Disco Inferno b Scott Armstrong, Sullivan b Doc Dean, Prince Aokia b AJ Boyd, Jarrett b Craig Pittman, Harlem Heat b Canadians, Morris b Renegade, Conan b Villano 4, Steve Regal b. Dean Eaton b. David Taylor, Chavo Guerrero Jr. b. Iaukea, Benoit b. Jim Powers, Ice Train b. Parka, Conan b. Johnny Swinger. February 8, Hamburg, Pennsylvania, ECW, 504, Little Guido b. Chris Chetty, Spike Dudley b. Corporal Punishment, Luis b. Coley b. Balls Mahoney, Supernova b. Cody Michaels, Gangstas b. Axel Rotten and D. Von Dudley, ECW tag titles, Eliminators b. Sabu and Rob Van Dam, ECW title Raven b. Sandman, Tommy Dreamer and Pit Bulls b. Chris Condito and Brian Lee and Shane Douglas. February 8, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, War, 2000 Sellout, Ryo Mai b. Tomohiro Ishii, Battle Ranger b. Onryo, Kamikaze b. Jun Kikuchi, Soryo Kino and Michiko Nagashima b. Miho Watabe and Michiko Omukai, Osamu Tashiakari b. Masakazu Fukuda, Nobutaka Araya b. Masaaki Mochizuki, Arashi and Shinichi Nakano b. Lance Storm and Yuji Ryoka, Genichiro Tenryu and Koki Kitahara and Tatsuo Nakano b. Nobukazu Hirai and Koji Kiao and Hiroshi Hatanaka. February 8, Yokosuka, All Japan Women, Momoe Nakanishi b. Yukishina b. Tanny Mouth, Mima Shimoda and Sai Endo b. Yoshiko Tamura and Genki Misae, All Japan title Ri Tamada b. Yumi Fukawa, Kumiko Maikawa and Tomoko Watanabe b. Kaoru Ito and Mariko Yoshida, Takako Inoue and Manami Toyota and Yumiko Harabi Asia Kong and Toshio Yamada and Kyoko Inoue. February 8, Yokohama IWA, Duder the Turtle b. Akihiko Masuda, Hirayoshi Katsubo b. Takeshi Sato, Akinori Tsukioka b. Wolf, Leatherface b. Kishin Kawabata, Bison Kimura and Emi Motokawa b. Alda and Esther Moreno, Geto and Jado and Hiromichi Fuyuki b. Daiko Kubo Benkei and Katsumi Hirano and Leatherface, Shigeo Okamura and Takashi Ishikawa b. Keizo Matsuda and Great Kabuki. February 8, Lima, Ohio, Global Wrestling Alliance, 225, Elvis Elliott b. Mr. Main Event, Road Hogg b. Jimmo Hesselfinger, Steve Nixon b. Mr. Bice, Storm Hawkins b. Mickey Dahmer, Scott Stone b. Jason Fabio, Crusher Klein b. Brian Fury DQ, KC Thunder b. Alexis Machine. February 8, Concord, NC, Carolina Championship Wrestling, 145, Tim Jackson b. David Osborne, David Isley b. Kevin Kirby, Cruel Connection, Gary Royal and Daryl Morris, B. Colt Steele and Big Cheese, Parente, Star Rider, Ray Hudson, B. Will Shooter, Ricky Nelson b. Royal, Mad Max, Chuck Coates, and Willie Clay b. Cannon and One Man Posse. February 9, East Rutherford, New Jersey Continental Arena, WWF, 8771, Rocky Maivia b. Leif Cassidy, Crush b. Barry Horowitz, WWF Tag Titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith b. Phil LaFon and Bob Holly, Savio Vega b. Phineas Godwin, Goldust b. Mankind, Farouk b. Undertaker DQ Aldo Montoya b. Salvatore Sincere, IC title Hunter Hearst Helmsley b. Henry Godwin, Sultan b. Ahmed Johnson, Bret Hart and Sid b. Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin. February 9, Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center, New Japan, 6000 Sellout, Akitoshi Saito b. Kazuyuki Fujita, Norio Onaga and Tatsuhito Takaiwa b. Black Cat and Chris Jericho, Hiro Saito and Marcus Bagwell b. El Samurai and Scotty Riggs, Michiyoshi Ohara and Kunyaki Kobayashi and Tatsutoshi Goto b. Yutaka Yoshi and Osamu Nishimura and Junji Hirata, Riki Chashu and Manabu Nakanishi b. Takashi Iizuka and Kazuo Yamazaki, Akira Nagami and Kengo Kimura and Tatsumi Fujinami b. Tadao Yasuda and Osamu Kito and Shinya Hashimoto, Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Masahiro Chono and Scott Norton b. Satoshi Kojima and Kensuke Sasaki and Keiji Muto, Koji Kanemoto b. Taka Michinoku, J. Crown Jushin Liger b. Shinjiro Otani. February 9, Downingtown, Pennsylvania, ECW, 980 Sellout, Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney b. Louis Piccoli and Chris Chetty, Spike Dudley b. Corporal Punishment, Little Guido b. Cody Michaels, Gangstas b. Bad Crew ECW title, Raven b. Rob Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer b. D. Von Dudley, Sabu b. Bubba Ray Dudley, three-way dance for ECW tag titles Eliminators 1 over Brian Lee and Shane Douglas and Pitbulls. February 9, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, JWP, 2000 Sellout, Tomoko Miyaguchi b. Asuno, Tomoko Kuzumi and Kanako Matoya b. Candy Akutsu and Borshoa Kid, Cutie Suzuki and Esther Moreno b. Alda Moreno and Plum Mariko, Judo Jacket Match, Kaoru Ito b. Hiromi Yagi, JWP Tag Titles Devil Masami and Hikari Fukuoka b. Mayumi Ozaki and Rieko Amano. February 9, Yamato FMW Mamoru Okamoto b. Samba Asako, Hideki Hasaka b. Hideo Makimura, Miwa Sato and Miss Mongol and Crusher Maidamari and Shark Tsuchiyabi Yoko Ikeda and Ri and Kaori Nakayama and Megumi Kudo, Wing Kanemura be Riki Fuji, Crypt Keeper and Hisakatsu Oya be Hayato Nanjo and Hayabusa, Street Fight Headhunters and the Gladiator be Makimura and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Masato Tanaka. February 9 Tanaka IWA Takeshi Sato be Akihiko Masuda, Tutor the Turtle be Akinori Tsukioka, Emimoto Kawa be Miyuki Sagabe, Leatherface be Katsumi Hirano, Keizo Matsuda and Daiko Kubo Benkei and Great Kabuki be Shige Okamura and Kishin Kawabata and Takashi Ishikawa. February 10 Jacksonville, Florida, WCW Monday Nitro tapings, 7,669 sellout / 5,924 paid, Dean Malenko be Eddie Guerrero Core, Conan be Bobby Eaton, Giant be Ron Powers, Steiners be High Voltage, WCW Tag Titles, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash be Ace Darling and Devon Storm, WCW TV Titles Steve Regal be Rey Mysterio Jr., Kevin Sullivan be Maverick Wild, Hugh Morris be Alex Wright, Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael be Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Jeff Jarrett. Special thanks to Bruce Bennett, Eddie Goldman, Woody Carlson, Adam Pennison, Ken Verrett, Manuel Gonzalez, Johnny Legend, Jesse Money, Dominic Valenti, Ron Lemieux, Bob Starr, Bobby Baum, Georgianne Macropolis, Dan Paris, Chris McCormick, Michael Monsky, Daniel Bird. Japanese Television Rundown. January 25, New Japan. 1. Tenzan and Hiro Saito beat Muto and Nishimura in 1346 when Tenzan pinned Nishimura after a headbutt off the top rope. The second half of the match aired and it was decent. 2 stars. 2. Yamazaki made Kobayashi submit to the Wakigatami, Fujiwara armbar, in 10 minutes. This was to build Yamazaki up for his title shot at Hashimoto on February 16. Last half of the match aired and it wasn't much. 1 star. 3. Otani and Kanemoto beat Liger and Samurai in 15-17 when Otani pinned Liger. Very good match, although Liger is clearly not at the level he was before the brain tumor. Otani and Kanemoto are really great as a team. All kinds of near falls ending when Liger went for his Liger bomb, but Otani reversed it into a Hurricane Rana, and then hit the Frankensteiner out of nowhere for the pin. 3 3/4 stars. 4. Hashimoto and Kojima and Hirata and Sasaki and Nakanishi beat Goto and Kimura and Akitoshi Saito and Nagami and Ohara in a best-of-3 fall match. Kimura pinned Hirata in 3:36 with a leg lariat to win the first fall. Sasaki pinned Nagami in 11:18 with a power slam to even it up. Hashimoto pinned Saito with a DDT in 11:15. Match was edited down to about 15 minutes for television. A good main event. 3 stars. February 1, New Japan. 1. Norton and Bagwell beat Sasaki and Kojima in 9:09. It was an American-style match for the most part. Kojima did a great job carrying the match. Finish saw Bagwell pin Kojima after what was supposed to be the buff blockbuster move he debuted on the NWO pay-per-view. Let's just say it turned out to be nowhere close this time. Bagwell worked really hard to get over. The match had good heat, particularly when Kojima was in with Norton. 3 1/4 stars. 2. Liger and Samurai beat Kanemoto and Jericho in 13:07. Kanemoto was in most of the way and looked great. Several near falls ending with Liger pinning Jericho with a Fisherman Buster off the top rope. Jericho didn't look as good as he usually looks in the US, even though you'd think working with Liger and Samurai should be right in his element. 3 3/4 stars. 3. Fujinami and Kimura beat Yamazaki and Iizuka in 16:16 when Fujinami used the Dragon Screw and got a submission with a figure 4 on Iizuka. The second half aired on television. 2 1/4 stars. 4. Muto and Hirata beat Hashimoto and Nakanishi in 16:04 when Muto made Nakanishi submit to the figure 4. Both wins with the same finish was to build up a tag title match between the two winning teams on February 8. The second half aired on TV. What aired was good. 3 stars. Top recorded pro wrestling crowds of all time. 170,000 April 29, 1995 Inoki vs. Flair Pyongyang, North Korea May Day Stadium. 150,000 April 28, 1995 Hashimoto vs. Norton Pyongyang, North Korea May Day Stadium. 78,000 March 29, 1987 Hogan vs. Andre Pontiac Silverdome. $1.6 million 75,000 August 29, 1992 Warrior vs. Savage London Wembley Stadium. $2.2 million 69,300 August 28, 1986 Hogan vs. Orndorff Toronto Exhibition Stadium. $800,000 $67,000 October 9, 1995 Muto vs. Takata Tokyo Dome, $6.1 million $65,000 April 29, 1996 Takata vs. Hashimoto Tokyo Dome, $5.7 million $64,500 March 21, 1991 Flair vs. Fujinami Tokyo Dome, $3.2 million $64,287 April 1, 1990 Hogan vs. Warrior Toronto Sky Dome, $3.2 million $64,000 January 4, 1996 Muto vs. Takata Tokyo Dome, $5.5 million $63,900 February 10, 1990 Tenryu and Tiger Mask, Misawa vs. Chashu and Takano Tokyo Dome, $3.2 million $63,500 January 4, 1993 Chashu vs. Tenryu Tokyo Dome, $3.5 million $62,500 January 4, 1995 Hashimoto vs. Sasaki Tokyo Dome, $4.8 million $62,500 January 1, 1997 Hashimoto vs. Chashu Tokyo Dome, $5.5 million $62,167 April 5, 1992 Hogan vs. Justice Indianapolis Hoosier Dome, $1.25 million heavily papered $60,525 January 19, 1997 Michaels vs. Sid San Antonio Alamo Dome, $480,013 with $48,014 paid $60,000 November 29, 1989 Maeda vs. Wilhelm Tokyo Dome, $2.9 million 1 star. $60,000 January 4, 1992 Chashu vs. Fujinami Tokyo Dome, $3.7 million $60,000 April 2, 1995 Weekly Pro Wrestling 13 Promotions Tokyo Dome Hashimoto vs. Chono, Est. $5.5 million multiple main event appearances on list of shows that have drawn in excess of 60,000, Hashimoto 5, Hogan 4, Chashu 4, Takata 3, Flair 2, Warrior 2, Muto 2, Tenryu 2, Sid 2 denotes fastest big show sellout 3 days after tickets went on sale. Puerto Rico. Dutch Mantle has jumped from WWA to WWC and had matches over the weekend booked against Carlos Colon, Invader No. 1 and Jim Steele. Aki Malumba, Giant Kimala 2 from All Japan, is scheduled to return. How's this for a made-up credential? On the television show last week it was announced that Gorgeous George III, Rob Kellum, who does have an amateur wrestling background, represented the U.S. in the Olympic Games. Also on television they aired the match from some 13 years back where NWA World Heavyweight Champion Ric Flair wrestled WWC World Heavyweight Champion Carlos Colon to create the Universal title, I guess attempting to re-establish Colon's belt as the premier belt in the world, which at one time fans in Puerto Rico bought, although 13 years later nobody buys it anymore. Flair did the job in that match, which was widely unknown in the U.S. at the time. EMLL except for the first night sellout at Korakuen Hall, the tour of Japan was not a success. We don't have the crowd figure for February 3rd in Nagoya, but February 4th in Kyoto drew and announced 850 and the climactic show of the tour on February 6th at Tokyo's Komazawa Olympic Park Gym drew and announced 1,350. In title matches on the tour, Rayo de Jalisco Jr. retained the CMLL heavyweight title on February 3rd beating Apollo Dantes via count out, while on February 6th, Espectro Jr. and Cadaver de Ultratumba retained the Distrito Federal Tag Team titles beating Shinobi and Ultraman Jr. Mariko Yoshida of All Japan Women won the CMLL Women's title from Lady Apache with La Magistral in 9:36, the only title change on the tour, and Black Warrior pinned Mr. Niebla to retain the NWA Light Heavyweight title. The climactic match on the tour saw Negro Casas pin El Hijo del Santo with La Magistral in 10:44. After the opening night in Tokyo where Santo worked as a heel and Casas as a face, they reversed roles with Casas back as a heel and Santo as a face. The biggest show of the week in Mexico was February 7th at Arena Coliseo headlined by Silver King beating La Fiera with a low blow after a ref bump. Emilio Charles Jr. was back on the heel side in the semifinal teaming with Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Satanico beating Dos Caras and Brazo de Oro and Atlantis. Charles Jr. had appeared to turn face in a recent program with Miguel Perez, but it was explained that with Perez having left Mexico, that Charles was only feuding with the Puerto Rican heel, and not that he had any problems with the heels in Mexico. That's actually a very typical storyline in Mexico as Connect did it for about 15 years, as the top local heels side with Mexico against the foreigners and join up with the faces when a foreign menace is around, but go back to their regular roles when the foreign menace leaves. Paco Alonso is attempting to get a one-night-only working arrangement with WCW to take part in a major show put together in conjunction with Antonio Inoki later this year. Promo Azteca. The first ever singles match with Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. El Hijo del Santo takes place on February 21st in Tijuana. Don't have results, but the major show of the week was February 7th in Xochimilco with Mascara Sagrada and Lizmark Jr. and Zorro vs. Blue Panther and Villano Tres and Zapatista in the main event. On the January 31st television taping in Xochimilco, Kanan, Super Calo and Psicosis all came to the ring wearing NWO t-shirts. This group ran a show on February 8th in McAllen, PX with Vampiro and Fantasma and Angel Azteca vs. Los Hermanos Dinamita on top. AAA. Antonio Pena filed a lawsuit against La Parca Alfo Tapia, claiming that Pena owned the rights to the Parca name and gimmick. On the February 21st show in Ciudad Madero, on this week's television they were no longer announcing Bret Hart as appearing but instead advertising that Jake Roberts, Diesel and Razor Ramon would return. Several angles this week. On February 7th in Neza, Blue Demon Jr. started a heel turn turning on Pantera and Mascara Sagrada Jr. in a trios match. The major show of the week was February 5th in Naucalpan where Mascara Sagrada Jr. retained his Mexican Minis title beating Mini Vader when Mini Paul Bearer's interference backfired. Mascara did a double springboard plancha and a corkscrew plancha during the match. In a match where Pantera and Demon Jr. and Latin Lover faced Pentagon and Avismo Negro and the Killer, Latin Lover once again kissed Janet. When Killer would hold Latin for Janet to hit with her shoe, Janet refused to attack Latin, but would still attack Pantera and Demon, who hadn't started his turn yet. The main event was Octagon and Mascara Sagrada and Pero Aguayo vs. Cibernetico and Pierroth Jr. and Fuerza Guerrera. Cibernetico worked Total Technico style which naturally got his partners mad. Finish was a DQ when the natural new feud began as the new Pentagon attacked Octagon and ripped up his mask while Guerrero was clocking everyone, including Cibernetico with a chair. All Japan. The new tour opens on February 17th, so the only bit of major information is that it was announced the main event of the March 1st Budokan Hall show will be Mitsuharu Misawa defending the Triple Crown against Steve Williams. The February 2nd television show airing the Misawa Kena Kobashi title changed it a 4.3 rating. New Japan. They had two major shows on February 8th and February 9th, both at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center and both drawing nearly packed houses of 6,000. On the first night, Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura retained the IWGP Tag Team titles beating Keiji Muto and Junji Hirata in 1930 when Fujinami pinned Hirata. The NWO, which is the rage on this tour, split two matches as Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Marcus Bagwell lost to Satoshi Kojima and Kensuke Sasaki and Riki Choshu when Kojima pinned Bagwell, while Scott Norton and Masahiro Chono beat Manabu Nakanishi and Shinya Hashimoto. February 9th was headlined by the junior heavyweights as Jushin Liger retained the J-Crown pinning Shinjiro Otani in 27-14, while Koji Kanemoto defeated Taka Michinoku in 14-41 to earn a title shot against Liger on February 16th at Sumo Hall. The third main event was another NWO vs. New Japan match with Chono and Tenzan and Norton beating Kojima and Sasaki and Muto when Norton pinned Sasaki. They're doing several American-style angles to push the NWO as the top heel group. Very similar to in the US, they are doing an angle where Chono refuses to sign his New Japan contract, doing the contract holdout gimmick, and of course he'll end up signing an NWO contract. The holdup in the storyline is that Chono's New Japan contract doesn't allow him to be merchandised or on NWO videotapes without New Japan's permission. The NWO's recruiting Muto, who is in the Sting role. Bagwell on February 6th in Age-So before a six-man tag asked Muto to join, but then Bagwell and Chono and Norton all jumped Muto and injured his shoulder. WCW is also recruiting Muto. WCW sent him a ring signifying his win at Battle Bowl. Muto noted that he had won the ring in 1992 and was just getting it new as a ploy to help WCW in its feud with NWO. On February 7th, after a six-man main event, all five NWO members in Japan, Chono, Tenzan, Saito, Norton, Bagwell, attacked Shinya Hashimoto. The NWO was on the cover of this week's Gong and its matches were the first ones covered. Shiro Koshinaka's return will be on the February 16th Sumo Hall show, most likely a singles match against Great Muta. Muta and Koshinaka had a famous 1990 singles match that they are playing off, as it was the first match Muto used the Muta gimmick in Japan on. Magazines are speculating that the Antonio Inoki vs. Dory Funk match will take place on June 15th. New Japan is attempting to book Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. January 25th TV show did a 2.8 rating. Other Japan notes. When Yoshiki Takahashi arrived at the Tokyo airport on February 10th, he was met by reporters and made a lot of comments regarding UFC. Takahashi said that his hand was okay after minor surgery and he wouldn't miss a date, with his next match being on March 22nd in Nagoya. He wasn't booked on the February 22nd Pancrase show because it was too close to UFC and you can't train for both at the same time. Takahashi said that Pancrase fighters are faster and more skilled overall than UFC fighters, and that the level of fighters overall is stronger in Pancrase. The February 22nd Pancrase show in Tokyo Bay NK Hall has Masakatsu Funaki vs. Semi Schultz, Yuki Kondo vs. Guy Mesger for the number 1 contendership, Masami Shibuya vs. Boss Rutan for the number 8 contendership, Ryushi Yanagisawa vs. Paul Leserby of Canada for the number 7 contendership, plus Takaku Fuke vs. Hagar Chen, Serge Narcission vs. Satoshi Hasegawa and Takafumi Ito vs. Keiichiro Yamamiya. The next rings show won't be until March 28th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall. Megumi Yabushita, 19, who placed third in the World Women's Wrestling Championships at 114 pounds in 1994 and was on 3 national teams, has joined the JD promotion. Gia has an interpromotional singles match headlining its February 23 Nagoya date with Chigusa Nagao vs. Mayumi Ozaki of JWP. Nagao and Akira Hokuto form a tag team to headline the February 16 Korakuen Hall show. JWP ran Korakuen Hall on February 9, drawing a sellout for Devil Masami and Hikari Fukuoka, keeping the JWP tag belts, beating Ozaki and Rieko Amano, and an interpromotional judo jacket match with AJW's Kaoru Ito beating JWP's Hiromi Yagi. Another soon-to-be retiring women's star, Megumi Kudo, announced at a press conference this week that she wanted singles matches against all the top stars from the different women's promotions before her retirement match on April 29. USWA Lance Russell returned as announcer on the February 8 television show, which also featured an appearance by Brian Pillman. Russell has agreed to do the show every week until the end of the month and will do it fairly often after that point, but refused to commit to a weekly regular deal because he's largely retired and spends a lot of time vacationing. Pillman showed up and played total heel, including one reference to Russell having Alzheimer's and claiming his personal friend Dr. Jack Kevorkian can take care of Russell's problems. On the show, Russell acknowledged Dave Brown's leaving, saying that Brown had done the show for 30 years, and it appeared almost that he and Jerry Lawler were trying to convince Brown to change his mind and returning. Crowds had been hovering at around the 350 mark on Thursdays in Memphis, but they moved to Sunday afternoon on February 9 and the crowd was nearly tripled for Stephen Dunn vs. Hysteria, Jesse James Armstrong vs. King Reginald, Mike Samples and Terry Golden vs. Bobby Bolton and Flash Flanagan, Brian Christopher vs. Spellbinder for the USWA title, Jerry Lawler vs. Grave Digger in a title vs. mask match, Billy Travis and Bill Dundee vs. Wolfie D and Jamie Dundee in a hospital elimination match, and the finale was a 10-man match where the loser of the fall has to leave town for 6 months with Lawler and Christopher and Bill Dundee and Flanagan and Travis vs. Wolfie and Jamie Dundee and Spellbinder and Grave Digger and Reginald. Hysteria is already doing jobs. Reginald is now copying all of Lawler's mannerisms, including the fist drop and pulling down the strap. People are joking that he's now a better wrestler than Lawler as well. Christopher and Spellbinder did an arm wrestling gimmick with lit candles on each side so the person who lost would have his hand put down on the candle. As Christopher was about to win, Spellbinder threw the candle on him and he sold his shoulder big time. Flash Flanagan's father, who did an interview while Flanagan was selling his injury angle, was at the studio, and you can guess what happened. As the Nation of Domination was attempting to injure Stephen Dunn, Flanagan's dad tripped Wolfie D. Spellbinder and Nation of Domination all beat up Flanagan's father until Flanagan made the save. Sonny is supposed to be on the television show next week. Apparently there were more problems with the announcers last week other than them just being bad. WMC management was upset with John Rainey being on the air because apparently he and the other announcer had ripped WMC's sister radio station since they work for a competition radio station, and they were unhappy about them being on their television station. ECW this week's shows were February 7th in Downingtown, Pennsylvania before a sellout 980 fans and February 8th in Hamburg, Pennsylvania before 504 fans. On February 7th in the key matches, Raven kept the ECW title over Rob Van Dam in what was described as a really good match with a messed up finish. The BWO came out and a new woman ran out who apparently was supposed to be held back by security, but security never touched her and she was in the ring, and it was described as being like the Miss Texas spot on the previous Monday's Nitro. Richards superkicked Van Dam, leading to Raven's win. Tommy Dreamer and Devon Dudley brawled into the parking lot. Dreamer won, but after Bubba Ray Dudley gave Dreamer the Bubba Cutter. Sandman ran in and caned everyone, but he ended up being laid out as well, doing an injury angle, so his match with Shane Douglas later in the show was cancelled. The Gangsters ran in but were also laid out. They also had a three-way dance where Eliminators beat both Pit Bulls and Douglas and Brian Lee. Rick Rude under the mask came out and Gary Wolf pinned Douglas with a rude awakening, but the eliminators then immediately gave Wolf total elimination. Told this was the worst three-way dance in the promotion to date. On February 8th, which was a subpar show because it was a small crowd in a fairly good-sized building, eliminators beat Sabu and Van Dam. The teams brawled into the bleachers. Taz wound up choking out Van Dam while Saturn made Sabu watch. Van Dam was pinned after a total elimination and they teased a Sabu-Van Dam split as they argued after the match. Raven and Sandman brawled all over the place. Sandman appeared to break his finger during the match as the bone was sticking out. They did the same BWO run-in for the finish. Main event saw Pitbulls and Dreamer over Triple Threat in what was described as a bad match, with Rude under the hood being involved once again. Some notes about the TV show that aired on February 6th. They opened the show making the announcement about the pay-per-view show, which was handled really well. Paul Heyman said that WCW knows that there is no way their main event can top Sabu vs. Taz. Well, if Hogan's in it, it can't. But there are plenty of others who could. They aired 4 bouts from the February 1st arena show, none of which were bad or good. Richards beat Ricky Morton in 5:22. Morton's new girlfriend wasn't Andrea, the woman who managed him in Memphis. She was a younger stripper type. Actually, this resulted in one of the funniest things I've seen in a long time in wrestling. The fans were chanting "Show your tits," as they do at every woman in sight, and Blue Meanie lifted up his shirt. Steve Williams beat Axel Rotten in 1:49 with the backdrop driver. Raven Williams went 7:15. They called Williams the most dominant American in the history of the All Japan promotion, which is a slight exaggeration, and built up that Williams hadn't been pinned in the US in more than a decade, which may be the case as it's hard to remember him doing a job. Of course, that set up the obvious finish. Both guys juiced, so our report about no juice until Funk Rich wasn't the case. Match was decent, not good, but the finish with BWO read a lot better than it actually looked. Sandman beat Devon Dudley in 5:20 in the other match, which was fair. The plan for the pay-per-view weekend is to run a house show on April 11th in the area, then hold a banquet for Terry Funk on April 12th, and the pay-per-view on April 13th. They are adding more bleachers and say they'll be able to put 2,300 into the arena for the show, which wounds hard to believe since they'll need more equipment in the building than ever before. There will be no special pyro or things of that nature as on WWF or WCW shows. The working idea would be to run a second pay-per-view in August and a third in November, here and there. The Billy Jack Haynes-Matt Bourne feud continued on the radio in Portland this past month. Haynes, who is now claiming pro wrestling is a work on his radio show, has challenged Bourne to a $10,000 winner-take-all shoot match. On Haynes' radio show, former wrestler Scott Ferris called up and also admitted pro wrestling was a work. Haynes then called up Sandy Barr and Bourne's radio show and issued the challenge and called Bourne a liar. Bourne said he hadn't told one lie all day. The conversation turned unintentionally hilarious at this point. Haynes, have you ever used a razor blade on your head? Bourne, I haven't told a lie all day. Haynes, have you ever used a razor blade on your head in the pros? Bourne, I haven't said a lie all day. Haynes, have you or haven't you? Bourne, listen, I didn't mean to get under your skin. Haynes, point blank question, Matt, have you ever used a razor blade on your head to induce blood? Bourne, say what you got to say, and then I'll speak my mind. Haynes, yes or no, have you ever used a razor blade on your head to force blood out of your head to make more money for the promoter? Bourne, have I ever used a razor blade? I used one this morning. It wound up with Haynes challenging Bourne to fight again, and Bourne telling Haynes to come down to the local wrestling matches and they'll fight. After Haynes hung up, Bourne said that he could whip Haynes because he's only a boxer. The next week, Bourne called up Haynes' show and told him to come down to the matches the next night. Haynes said if Bourne put up $10,000 he'd fight him. The two argued again until Haynes accused Bourne of being on cocaine. Bourne then called Haynes a liar because he said he had been propositioned by homosexuals when he was in the WWF. Haynes then asked Bourne whatever happened to Doink the Clown. You failed your piss test, didn't you? That's what you told me. Did you fail your piss test, Matt Doink, whatever your name is? Bourne then responded, tell me about being propositioned by homosexuals. That was about the end of it. Don Harris of the Bruise Brothers and Grimm Twins recently sued a plastic surgeon in Nashville for malpractice regarding the scars on his chest. The case went to a hung jury this past week. Abdullah the Butcher will appear for Texas All-Star Wrestling on March 22nd at the Humble, Texas Bingo Hall. If you mention the Observer, you can get $1 off any ticket. For more info, call 281-548-5856. Cleveland All-Pro Wrestling on February 22nd at West Park Center has Ian Rotten vs. Madman Pondo in a thumbtacks death match with fans being asked to bring their own thumbtacks. For more info, call 216-476-1000. 1357. Sage Stallone, son of Sly, did a run-in on a recent incredibly strange wrestling show in Hollywood, California on February 2nd. Bruce Hart will be working as a guest referee on March 1st for Ultimate Championship Wrestling at the Elks Lodge in Elmhurst, New York. NHB. There will be a pay-per-view show taped on February 15th in Birmingham, Alabama, which will air on March 14th on Action Pay-Per-View, which covers about 8 million homes or less than one-third of the total pay-per-view universe, so its chances of being profitable are something less than slim, which will be the first show of the World Fighting Federation, WFF. It's the show headlined by Gokor vs. Maeda, only now they're saying it isn't Akira Maeda, after some internet squawking about a fake pro wrestler, but a guy named Bel Maeda, who happens to be about the same height and weight as Akira. There will also be an 8-man tournament with Oleg Toktarov involved along with pro wrestler Tony Halme, Ludwig Borga. Some notes as to the actual wrestling level and placings of some of the NHB grapplers. At the Olympic trials, Tom Erickson placed second in the super heavyweights, behind Bruce Baumgartner. Mark Kerr, scheduled to debut in the U.S. at the next EFC after winning a tournament in Brazil on January 19th, placed third at 220, behind Kurt Angle and Danny Chade, while Mark Coleman, who won the trials in 1992 and placed seventh in the Olympics, placed sixth. At 180, Kevin Jackson, who debuts on the next EFC, who won the gold in 1992, placed second, while at 163, Kenny Monday, who also debuts at UFC, a former gold medalist, won and was on the Olympic team but didn't medal. Kevin Randleman was a former NCAA champion at Ohio State at 165 pounds but either didn't enter or didn't place in the trials. WCW. Nitro on February 10th in Jacksonville drew a sellout 7,669, 5,924 paying $65,134 for another convoluted show. The only good wrestling was the opener where Dean Malenko beat Eddie Guerrero via countout in 4:56 when Guerrero was chasing Six, who tried to leave with the U.S. belt. Another totally flat finish to what was a good match. Diamond Dallas Page came out and challenged anyone to do whatever they wanted to him. Sting and Randy Savage came out. Sting did the bat gimmick so Page is on his team, but Savage stole the bat back from Page after and left. Conan beat Bobby Eaton in 120 with a Northern Lights buster. Lex Luger came out with his arm in a cast and Eric Bischoff wouldn't let him wrestle for his own good and said if he didn't have a doctor's release by the end of the show he wouldn't be allowed to work at Super Brawl. It wound up with Giant coming out and choke-slamming Ron Powers in 146. Giant said that he'd take Hall and Nash on by himself, and if he wins, he'd give the other tag belt to Luger. Bischoff was good in his role. Steiner's beat High Voltage. Bischoff, Nash, Hall, etc. came out and they brought out Randy Anderson, his wife and 2 kids. Anderson begged Bischoff for his job back and Bischoff basically laughed at him. After the previous week with Piper's kid, using more kids was just a bit much. Nobody cared. This set up a Randy Anderson vs. Nick Patrick match on Nitro next week, and if Anderson wins, he gets his job back. Hall and Nash defended the tag titles against the Extreme Team, Ace Darling and Devon Storm, built from Stamford, Connecticut. Just for a clarification, Tony Rumble actually came up with the name The Extremis for Storm and Darling, and it had to do with the Extreme games on ESPN and Extreme Sport, and not ECW. However, in WCW, they were renamed the Extreme Team and continually get squashed in an embarrassing fashion which appears to be clearly aimed at ECW. Even Hall and Nash's interview was lame, which was about to become a pattern. Steve Regal and Rey Mysterio Jr. went to among the shortest 10 minutes draws in history. Actually 6:56. My how time flies when you're watching a miserable match. Regal and Mysterio Jr. are both great, but it totally kills Mysterio Jr.'s illusion when you see him with a guy who is the size of Regal. The match was even worse than I feared, and worse than that, it's the beginning of a program between the two. Mysterio Jr.'s knee is nowhere near ready, but they told him it was important he worked the Nitro because they were beginning a new program for him. Kevin Sullivan beat Northeast indie wrestler Maverick Wild in a match most noted for Jacqueline throwing forearm smashes, a lariat and doing a body slam on Wild which got huge pops. Sullivan then delivered among the nuttiest interviews in pro wrestling history. Sullivan talked about having a phone call with he and Nancy's best friend Paul E. Sullivan and Paul Heyman were on the phone when he said and basically talked about exactly what he said, which sort of kills Heyman's illusion about ECW hating WCW when it comes out that the WCW booker thinks the ECW booker is one of his closest friends. He then talked about Jim Barnett. Apparently Sullivan is of the belief that Barnett is secretly behind the scenes manipulating everything in WCW, Mark Lewin, Curtis Iaukea, and more nonsense. Kevin and Nancy are trying so hard to make everyone believe they're now separated that they actually are, although behind the scenes they are political allies while in front of all the wrestlers they are not on speaking terms. Once these guys fooled people for a few days with Brian Pillman, an angle which drew no money for anyone, except wrestling hotlines, they lost their perspective, and now think their job is to work the wrestlers. Hugh Morris pinned Alex Wright and Steve McMichael, and Chris Benoit beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Jeff Jarrett when Deborah talked with Jarrett while McMichael destroyed Guerrero. The Horseman interview went nowhere and had no point, memorable only because Ric Flair was there in body, but not in mind, and because a fan threw popcorn which got caught in Deborah McMichael's hair and nobody could get it out of her hair during the interview. The show closed with a Piper Hogan deal with Hogan supposedly via satellite. Hogan tried to hold the segment together but Piper was way out there. Luckily Piper can get away with anything. He tried to make a crack that Hogan would fit in San Francisco, as if it made Hogan gay, which is silly since Piper is the face and the match is in San Francisco. He then made a comment about Rodman giving the illusion he's gay. Ironic since WCW has been battling WWF in negotiating to use Rodman. Going unopposed, Nitro did a 3.8 rating and 5.8 share, 3.5 first hour, 4.2 seconds hour, which still beat out the dog show on USA doing a 3.7 and 5.6 share. Replay did a 1.4 rating and 3.4 share. Other weekend numbers saw main event at 1.2, Saturday night at 2.5 and Pro doing a strong 2.1. There had at least been interest in using Reggie White at the March 16th uncensored pay-per-view. Kevin Green is trying to clear things with the Carolina Panthers to work that show as well. The White deal was mentioned on the WCW hotline, which caused the higher-ups to decree that nothing relating to contract status and negotiations are allowed to be talked about on the hotline. There was also heat about WCW's hotline talking about Harlem Heat potentially going to Titan. At one time that was a possibility, but it seems to be a long shot or dead now. Jacques Rougeau's press conference for his April 11th show in Montreal got more media publicity than any show anyone can remember ever in the city. All three newspapers covered the press conference along with every TV and radio station, attributed to a combination of Rougeau's aggressive promotion and the appearance of Hulk Hogan. There was tape on every evening newscast and a photo of the Giant and Pierre-Carl Ouellet in a shoving match while promoter Cookie Lazarus was laughing. The irony of the promoter laughing while a serious situation was going on is why the photo made the front page of the Montreal Gazette. The complete show besides Hogan vs. Jacques and Pierre vs. Giant in a pirate match, Giant must wear an eye patch, has Flair vs. Luger, Heat vs. Faces of Fear, Malenko vs. Guerrero, a midget match with local midgets and Mike Payette and Ron Trottier and Eric Shelley vs. Serge and Martin Rolland and Richard Charlon and Nelson Veilleux vs. Sonny War Cloud, who are local area wrestlers that worked for Rougeau's defunct promotion. Most notable line was Rougeau asking Hogan how old he was, and Hogan said 43, and Rougeau's replay to a lot of laughing was that he asked him how old he was, not how many years he'd been wrestling. Local sports columnist Jack Todd wrote a story about the proceedings. Todd, who is 6'6", appeared to be 2 inches taller than Hogan, which didn't go unnoticed by anyone including Hogan, who refused to take a photo with Todd unless Todd scrunched down because it would ruin the gimmick of his size. Todd said that Hogan was 6'4" and 250 pounds. He also wrote Giant was nowhere near 7'4" and 450, but he was one of the biggest humans he'd ever seen. The French newspapers brought up Andre the Giant, or Jean Fer as he was known in Montreal, who lived in Montreal for many years before becoming an international superstar, when talking about the new Giant and talking about him being billed as Andre's son. Rougeau at the press conference said he'd sell the 24,000-seat Molson Center out, which would break the all-time city indoor attendance mark set by Jean Fer vs. Don Leo Jonathan in 1972. Dennis DiPaolo in Buffalo is putting together a second annual Ilio DiPaolo Memorial Show for later this year. Both Lou Thesz and Bruno Sammartino have agreed to be a part of it. There isn't exactly good blood between the two these days, as Sammartino was said to have been furious about Thesz claiming in his book that he'd have easily beaten Sammartino had it been a shoot, and pretty much praising Sammartino as a person, but knocking his lack of true wrestling ability. Expect Randy Savage back in the ring sooner than later. Ric Flair is talking about his first match back being on the May pay-per-view show in Charlotte, but he's being advertised for the April 11th show in Montreal. Expect Sting back in the ring later than sooner. Besides Nitro, the only other house show was the Saturday night tapings in Jackson, Tennessee on February 4th, which drew 2,000 paid and $29,000. Nothing noteworthy on the first hour other than giving people like Ron Powers, Villano 4 and Roadblock wins. Eddie Guerrero drew Malenko in a U.S. title match which was really good again. From February 6th on they were at Disney doing the massive TV tapings. Virtually no news came from the tapings. They didn't even make an attempt now to give lip service to the idea of long-term planning. None of the big names even appear at the tapings. No Sting, no Savage, no Flair, no Luger, no Anderson, and no NWO. No major newcomers. Neither Psicosis nor Juventud Guerrera got across the border, and Mysterio Jr. didn't work the tapings due to an injury. La Parka, who couldn't even walk on Tuesday after blowing out his knee in the match with Ice Train on Monday, actually was back by Thursday and got the biggest babyface pop of anyone in a match with JL, which made no sense. Almost as much sense as Parka being a heel at the rest of the tapings, and once again putting over Ice Train. Biggest reactions came from Jacqueline throwing the forearms and clotheslines on Sullivan's opponents. British wrestlers Robbie Brookside and Doc Dean were brought in as jobbers on the recommendation of Regal. Reports were they were a big disappointment. The reason Jacqueline couldn't find the chair at the February 3rd Nitro during the angle is because it was the chair that Paige had used to hold off the NWO earlier in the show. NWO Sold Out did an estimated 0.47 buy rate, 117,000 buys, $1.31 million, which was basically half of what Starrcade did, so it was a huge flop by that standard as well. This can be attributed perhaps to the idea that fans don't want to pay $27.95 to see what they believe to be screw jobs. And after that Robin Hood fiasco, horrible match, horrible ending, it didn't help that the pay-per-view had a Hogan Giant main event. Bottom line is that NWO is really over to the most serious fans who buy ringside tickets and merchandise, but its appeal to the casual masses isn't nearly what people thought. Complete February 23rd Cow Palace lineup is Hogan vs. Piper for the title. Hall and Nash defend tag titles against Giant in a handicap match. Sullivan vs. Benoit in a San Francisco death match. I guess the stipulations are that the two smoke dope on a street corner until one passes out, with Jacqueline strapped to woman. McMichael vs. Jarrett, and if Jarrett wins, he's in the Four Horsemen. Malenko defends Cruiserweight title against Six. Guerrero defends U.S. title against Chris Jericho. Page vs. Bubba. Regal defends TV title against Mysterio Jr. in an extended time limit match. A Four Corners tag match with Steiner's Harlem Heat, Public Enemy and Faces of Fear, with the winners getting the next tag title shot. And Konnan Parka and Villano 4 vs. Psicosis and Juventud Guerrera and Super Calo. I strongly suspect the particulars in the six-man will change around, as they haven't figured a way to get Psicosis and Guerrera in the country, and as it's structured, you've got a face, a heel and a tweener against two heels and a face. The show was actually sold out a few days ago, but they are opening up a few thousand more seats. The Sting at the NWO pay-per-view in the rafters was actually Jeff Farmer, Imposter Sting, and not Steve Borton. Nitro on March 10th has been moved from Birmingham, Alabama to Panama City, Florida, on the beach at Club La Vale, which is where MTV holds its spring break party. They did have a cute finish as Disney in a triangle match with Canadians, Public Enemy, and High Voltage. Jacques was about to do Le Cannonball with Pierre onto one of Voltage, but Rocco Rock knocked Pierre off the ropes and climbed up, and Jacques did the flip with him and he pinned Voltage. And since whomever scores the pin wins the match, it made P the winners. The plan right now is for the June pay-per-view show to be June 15th from the Fleet Center in Boston. WWF. Actual paid attendance in Toronto on January 31st was 23,127. They spent all week billing it as the largest crowd in the history of Monday Night Wrestling, which technically wouldn't be true since January 31st was not a Monday, and because there have been Tokyo Dome shows on Mondays. On a radio show in Chicago this past week, Vince McMahon and Jim Ross were guests hyping WrestleMania, and in the conversation the Road Warriors were brought up by a caller. I don't have the exact wording, but a listener said they talked as if they might be bringing them in, but I don't know the exact context it was brought up in. Yokozuna is said to have lost 310 pounds, which I'd assume could have only come from some sort of cosmetic surgery. Only announced match added to the pay-per-view on February 16th from Chattanooga is Farouk and Crush and Savio Vega vs. Goldust and Rocky Maivia and Flash Funk. Injuries and illness continues to plague the crew as lots of guys are sick. Doug Furnace was hospitalized all week with pneumonia and won't be back until February 14th. Vader also missed the entire weekend. Funk was injured in Pittsburgh on February 7th and missed the rest of the weekend. Steve Austin was on MTV's Idiot Savants TV show this past week. The final live shotgun show from Penn Station in New York on February 8th saw Farouk and Crush over Godwins in 11:17, Hunter Hearst Helmsley over Undertaker by DQ when Undertaker hit Helmsley with the belt Helmsley had brought into the ring. After the match they brawled up the escalator and Undertaker tombstoned him on the escalator and he rolled to the bottom. A match with Savio Vega versus Aldo Montoya turned into a six-man with Farouk and Crush and Godwin's back involved for 2022 amidst loud boring chants before the heels won. After the match, Pat Patterson got slopped by the Godwins and he got up and said he was going to kiss Sonny. Entertainment Tonight was filming Sonny at the show. Apparently the plan still is to do the angle where Billy Gunn is wheelchair bound and gets up from the chair and attacks Bart a la the Sandman Dreamer angle of a few years ago. Lowell, Massachusetts for the live Raw on February 13th is basically already sold out, 2,700. Weekend house show saw February 7th in Pittsburgh draw 8,923 and $147,731. February 8th in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania drew 4,298 and $64,194, and February 9th in East Rutherford, New Jersey drew 8,771 and $177,375, so it was a very successful swing. At the February 9th show, it was announced that Furnace would be replaced by Bob Holly, groans, Funk would be replaced by Henry Godwin and Vader would be replaced by Sultan, and refunds were offered. In the tag title match, Bulldog and Owen Hart beat Holly and Phil LaFon. They did the finish where the faces won, but Hart's foot was on the ropes and the bout was restarted, and eventually the champs retained. Goldust beat Mankind after Goldust hit him with the urn. Goldust got little face reaction until the finish. Farouk beat Undertaker via DQ when Taker tombstoned him on a chair. Helmsley beat Godwin in the title bout with his feet on the ropes. Sultan beat Ahmed Johnson with the camel clutch after outside interference by Farouk, Crush and the rest of the Nation of Domination. They continued to beat on Johnson after the match until George Steele did a run-in and threw himself on top of Johnson's body. Maine saw Bret and Sid beat Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin. Reports on both this match and the bout in Pittsburgh were very strong. All four were cheered coming out, but once the bout started, Bret and Sid got the face reaction and Michaels was neither cheered nor booed. Finish saw Austin give Michaels a stone-cold stunner, to a huge face reaction, and Hart pinned him. Same basic stuff happened February 7th in Pittsburgh except it was Funk losing to Helmsley. February 8th in Bethlehem they reversed things putting Mankind over Goldust and Johnson over Sultan with the same tag match, which figures to draw big across the board. To give Holly credibility as a tag title challenger, they added a singles match where Holly beat Owen Hart before putting Holly into a tag title match later in the show. Weekend ratings saw Blast Off set a record doing in 0.9. Live Wire also set a record doing a 1.3 while Superstars did a 1.5. Upcoming pay-per-view schedule after Mania is April 20th in Rochester, New York, May 11th in Baltimore, June 8th King of Ring in Providence, July 6th in Calgary, August 3rd SummerSlam in East Rutherford, New Jersey, September 7th in Louisville, October 5th in St. Louis, and Survivor Series on November 9th at the Molson Center in Montreal. Former boxer George Chuvalo, who did an angle with Owen Hart in Montreal a few months back, worked the Toronto show on January 31st and threw a punch knocking down Steve Austin as he tried to interfere in the Sid-Shawn-Bret Triangle match main event. Al Snow is expected to get a new gimmick where he'll wear a mask and feud with the AAA wrestlers. The readers' pages. Jerry Graham. You did a wonderful job capturing both the history and the spirit of Dr. Jerry Graham. I only met Graham once in the mid-70s, spending an evening out with him and 3 other wrestling fans. I saw many of the traits that both you and Kurt Brown pointed out. He got very drunk. He had a passion for pro wrestling, spoke very fondly about his mother and was highly intelligent. Graham had a big run with the WWF from late 1963 through 1965. He started out as the top contender to new champion Bruno Sammartino, having a series of matches at Madison Square Garden. He was a top heel and didn't do a lot of jobs until the end of his run to the top faces like Bobo Brazil and Argentina Apollo. A minor history correction. On the WWF US Tag Team title run with Luke Graham, they won the belts at a house show in Providence, Rhode Island from Apollo and Don McClarity. They held them for a good part of 1 year, which was a long reign in those days. They lost the belts on Washington, D.C. to Gene Kiniski and Waldo Von Erich. Luke lost both falls and Jerry never got in the ring during the match. During the period Jerry and Luke held the tag titles, Eddie made a brief return and they ran 6-man tags with all 3. Mike Omansky. Wyckoff, New Jersey. That was an excellent bio on Dr. Jerry Graham. I saw the Graham brothers many times in the 50s and can remember them inciting an audience probably better than anyone before or after. Their matches with Mark Lewin and Don Curtis were classics, as were their matches against Argentina Rocca and Miguel Perez. Juice was common on television in those days and the Grahams never failed to deliver, either on themselves or their opponents, usually both. Their matches against Chief Big Heart and Kit Fox were bloodbaths. Jerry was great on interviews, as was their manager, Bobby Davis. I have to say my interest got started in wrestling by watching Jerry Graham and Johnny Valentine. I watched Vern Gagne, Yukon Eric, Art Nielsen, Reggie Lasowski and many others, but few could put on a show like the Graham brothers. Dr. Jerry should be in any wrestling hall of fame. I believe you are too hard on Steve McMichael's skills of lack thereof. The last few times I watched him convinced me he just needs more training. I remember strongman-type wrestlers with a lot more experience that didn't do much more than McMichael in the ring. Yukon Eric, Morris Shapiro and Moose Kalak come to mind. I believe if Flair or Sullivan or one of the older wrestlers would help him develop a signature finishing hold, it would help his matches. Some maneuver like a swinging full Nelson or Johnny Powers powerlock would work for him because of his size. Dick Fogerland, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Jerry Graham was my introduction to the world of bad guy wrestlers. His bloody battles with Chief Big Heart were legendary. His matches with Dick the Bruiser or Roy Shire as his partner made me very angry as my heroes met unfair defeats. That emotion intensified when he joined forces with Brother Eddie and laid waste to the Bastion brothers and Lewin and Curtis. Then I met Jerry Graham after the matches one night. While all of the so-called babyfaces rushed by their adoring fans without a word, or a few with some very rude ones, Jerry and Eddie Graham stayed behind and signed autographs for every one of us and answered all our questions. It was an eye-opener and I became a Graham fan for life. Occasionally this put me in some uncomfortable circumstances, and I very vocally cheered with Doc amidst a sea of equally vocal Rocca or Carpentier or Lewin and Curtis fans. Whatever his faults, Graham was one of the most entertaining performers the sport has ever had and clearly one of the most convincing heels. Except perhaps for Steve Austin, everybody today pales by comparison. Steve Aronson. Arlington, Virginia. Japan. Yes, David Kakalishvili won the World Sambo Championships, but the heavyweight division was a thin weight class and the Wow Wow program even acknowledged that the toughest division was the middleweights. Rings is always modest about their fighters' non-pro competitions, including the credentials of several Olympic athletes, but it is well known that they are all real world-class elite athletes, which gives them a lot of credibility. Rings has never advertised themselves as pro wrestling and lists themselves as total fight martial arts in Wow Wow listing and in all the TV guides. The reason Pancrase advertises itself as pro wrestling is marketing reasons. The pro wrestling universe, including the mainstream magazine readership, is much larger than the martial arts community, so they wanted to capitalize on the fame of Minoru Suzuki and Masakatsu Funaki. The fact that Satoru Sayama's shooting promotion made the mistake to push itself only as a shoot martial arts sport may have limited the penetration and popularity of the new shooting martial art. The reason Boss Rutan's name was missing from the top 10 in the Pancrase ratings was a technical reason. The rankings have written rules in that anyone who misses a scheduled event for a reason other than an injury loses their rating. Masami Ozaki didn't know the rule initially and used it as an excuse for preparing for the worst-case situation, that of Rutan jumping to K1 or rings. However, Rutan's priority is truly for his first baby and his girlfriend rather than being the king of Pancrase. I think all the top 10 rated fighters are very close in skill right now, so fans know the rankings don't mean as much anymore. The JD story may not be an angle. I went to see the promotion live in Osaka on December 23rd. They drew 400 to 600. I predicted correctly the upset with Kuga beating Bison Kimura on December 29th. Jaguar Yokota and Lioness Asuka seemed to have a problem with the office and the show indicated that. Not only Kuga was the best worker on the December 23rd show, but also got over big among casual fans. Yoshimoto, based in Osaka, is a huge entertainment conglomerate, but they don't support the JD division both financially as well as a push as compared to their other divisions. Tadashi Tanaka. New York, New York. I've seen a gradual shift in the wrestling style of the Big Two in Japan over the past year. All Japan main events used to consist of submissions for the first 15 minutes, then hot moves and false finishes over the last 10 minutes. Now they start out with dangerous bumps and build the match psychology around that, instead of submissions. New Japan has adopted the submission style in the heavyweight division, especially with Shinya Hashimoto on top. They rarely tease pins, and evidenced by the super grade tag finals when Hashimoto pinned Rick Steiner out of nowhere. Other than Keiji Muto versus Shiro Koshinaka matches, most of the heavyweight division is wrestled on the mat working submissions. Another trend in Japan is the ascension of bad American workers to good to great Japanese workers, ranging from Scott Norton, the Patriot, and Johnny Ace. Is this because they are working with top workers or that they work a lot harder and a lot stiffer over there? It's amazing how WCW has Chris Benoit, one of the best technical wrestlers, and they got him over as an interview and a brawler and not as a great wrestler. Whose decision is it not to use the Dragon Suplex as a finisher? His finishes are always booked so badly. I've got some comments on the awards. The Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi March 31, 1996 match, Sabu vs. 2 Cold Scorpio at CyberSlam 96 and Chris Benoit vs. Dean Malenko should have easily cracked the top 20 matches of the year. Shinjiro Otani should have won Wrestler of the Year since he was the opponent for Benoit. Jushin Liger, El Samurai and Ultimo Dragon's best matches of the year in Japan. He was also involved in Eddie Guerrero's best match of the year in the United States at Starrcade 95. Mankind should have been voted worst gimmick and Vince McMahon worst booker. Who could vote for him ahead of Baba? McMahon transformed the best interview of last year into the worst of this year, just like he did last year with Shane Douglas. Look how WWF has ruined Brian Pillman. People actually have forgotten how great he was for part of the year. Baba should be voted best booker every year because he's the only booker who employs 100% clean finishes. Craig Collins. Ancona, Connecticut. WCW. I'm sure a lot of fans are angry at WCW and TNT for the stunt they pulled on the January 13th Nitro. Using a Hogan Giant match to sucker viewers into watching Robin Hood was underhanded, but it does illustrate just how far this promotion has come. 2 years ago, WCW was the ugly stepsister of billionaire Ted's empire. No other branch of the Turner organization wanted any dealings with the wrestling outfit. Now, WCW is being hailed as a key ingredient in making TNT the top-rated cable network in prime time, and network officials are looking to Nitro to help launch an important new show. Given WCW's talent roster, bank account and aggressive approach toward beating the WWF, it seems unlikely that Nitro's ratings success will end at any time soon. Eric Bischoff deserves a lot of credit. He has made WCW a consistent winner, and the #1 promotion in the United States in the eyes of the casual wrestling audience. Bruce Buchanan. Lugoff, South Carolina. I know a lot of people hate Eric Bischoff, but he did convince the real top brass to spend money, which is what brought in the top talent, and in the case of Hulk Hogan, the big-name draw to the casual fans. By making Nitro live and 2 hours long, he not only made it the show to watch, with high ratings and packed arenas every week, but he made the WWF improve to compete. Sure, it looks like it's gone to his head, and he'd better wake up if he thinks the WWF is dead. A 2-hour live WWF show, now that they have some great talent and good booking, may bring Bischoff back to earth. Before he talks about a lame Royal Rumble, someone should force him to watch Sold Out. They also should do what they did a few years ago and force the members of the booking committee off the air and out of the ring. The WWF, entirely due to competition, has some great things going. A new look Undertaker, the Harts, Michaels, and especially Steve Austin. ECW is still the innovator. However, they need to move to a bigger building. Being they've packed the ECW arena for the past 2.5 years and turned people away, they can sell 2,000 to 3,000 tickets for each show. Wrestling is exciting today. To keep it that way, no office should be content with what they accomplished in 1996. Dave Katz. Mount Holly, New Jersey. I have to agree with your comments on WWF and WCW handling of the minis. I was at the Raw taping in Albany. Mascarita Sagrada Jr. and Minnie Vader put on a great show. Their Rumble match was a real stinker compared to what they did in Albany. I hope the minis are used to their full potential in the future on TV and pay-per-view. You're right on about Steve Austin. He gets better every week. It's hard to get someone over when they never do interviews. Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon are probably the best tag team the WWF has ever had, yet they don't get pushed at all. Dwayne Johnson is getting a major push when the weakest part of the WWF is the tag team division. The NWO angle is getting worse every week. Please make major changes quickly. Tom Sanders. Ballston Spa, New York. Much to my excitement, I learned WCW was coming to a neighboring town. West Plains, Missouri is located in rural south-central Missouri, a town of 15,000. The show was promoted heavy on local radio and the Civic Center was packed to new capacity. The lineup promised sounded first-rate. Lex Luger, the Giant, Faces of Fear, Nasty Boys, Jeff Jarrett, Big Bubba, Steve Regal, Six, Vincent, High Voltage, Rey Mysterio Jr., and Juventud Guerrera. The ring announcer stated at the beginning that Jerry Saggs was injured and wouldn't be appearing. That's no big deal. But what happened after was a big deal. By the time the main event started, we had witnessed 4 25-minute matches that included every rest hold known to man. The low point of my adult life was watching Renegade vs. Terry Taylor wrestle for what seemed like 3 hours. The crowd chanted boring for over 5 minutes. Finally, it was time for the main event. Faces of fear came to the ring. Luger came out, grabbed the house mic and said he had no idea where the Giant was, but would still take the match. A perfect end to a perfect night. I felt totally ripped off. So what if we live in a rural town? Does that give WCW the right to crap on us with this poor excuse of a show? No mention of refunds was made, nor was any mention made of Mysterio Jr. and Guerrera. The crowd was very disappointed in the efforts put forth by WCW, except for the performance by Steve Regal, Nick Patrick, and Six. The whole card sucked. Tim Hager, Van Buren, Missouri. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-122. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.